So, should you buy the MacBook Air M3? It's just $100 a pound or 15,000 rupees more expensive than the M2 Air. With a faster new chip, it should be an easy upgrade to recommend, right? Well, I know this sounds crazy, but for most people, I don't think I can recommend it, except in two very specific cases. In this video, I'm going to help you cut the clutter, and I'm not going to just throw tech jargon and benchmarks at you, but I'll help you really understand what they mean for you and your hard-earned money. Let's get into it. Here's the headline summary. The new MacBook Air M3 released in March 2024 with 5 big changes. First, the processor, which is upgraded to the M3 chip, and the graphics processor is slightly faster and also supports hardware accelerated ray tracing. Second, the anodized coating on the midnight blue color, which used to fingerprint like crazy, has been improved. Third, there's now support for 2 5K external monitors with the lid closed versus just one in the earlier models. Fourth, the hard drive or the SSD has finally been improved, or shall I say restored to the perfectly good M1, where we finally have 2 SSD chips again so that the read and the write speed on the hard drive isn't slow like it was on the M2. And fifth, well, it's priced at $11.99 a pound or euros or 1,15,000 rupees, while the M2 has now dropped down 100 less to $1,099 a pound or euros or 99,000 rupees. And the M1 isn't sold on Apple's website anymore, but it's still available while stocks last on third-party websites like Amazon, and I think it's an absolute steal. Watch my full video, I'll link up here if you want to know more. Okay, so given all these things, can I recommend that you buy the M3 MacBook Air over the M2? Well, not really, except in 2 specific cases. Let me explain. First, let's talk about the M3 chip. It's obviously faster. Most benchmarks have it at 22% faster than the M2 on the CPU. And remember, this is not a new chip. We've seen this chip family already on the MacBook Pro and the iMac. But for most people who do everyday computing tasks like using apps, browsing, email, a bit of photo and video editing, you don't need an M3. You don't even really need the M2. The M1 itself is more than enough to do all of this with ease. If I were you, I would use the money that you save by buying the M2 or M1 and invest it in some more RAM or storage, especially if you do editing. And now look, for the few people who are watching this and actually want to get use out of that full power of the M3 chip, they should look at a MacBook Pro with the M3 chip because it has a cooling fan. And without a fan, the MacBook Air M3 throttles the performance a bit so that it doesn't overheat, and that's why the M3 looks less and less impressive in tests where there are sustained workloads like Cinebench. Now let's quickly cover the graphics as well. The benchmarks show that it's 4 to 5% faster than the M2 and includes hardware accelerated ray tracing, which apart from people who do complex processing like 3D modeling, the only real application for a typical user like you and me is gaming. Now for any gamers watching, before you close this video saying, is this guy serious? Who games on the MacBook Air? I agree. All I'm saying is that compared to before, it does manage to run games that are made for Apple Silicon like Resident Evil 4 pretty well. And if you want to use the highest settings, which of course you're going to want to, then you're going to have to play it on a PS5. I mean, no one who's serious about gaming plays Resident Evil on a MacBook Air, like no one. Okay, so the GPU is not a big value add either. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The chip on the MacBook Air is mostly a marketing gimmick that Apple uses to get people to upgrade or pay more, especially on the MacBook Air. It makes no perceptible difference to most users in real life, and I want you to save your money and invest it in features that actually matter. Just like I'd like to request you to invest in a small, hardworking creator like me by subscribing to my channel, liking this video and asking me questions or sharing your experience in the comments below. Okay, so next let's talk about the improved anodized midnight blue coating, which I talk about in detail in my full review of the MacBook Air M2, which I'll leave up here. And as you all know, it fingerprinted like crazy. And Apple says that they've improved it with the new coating, but most reviewers who tested it say that it's the same mostly. So it looks like someone at Apple fluffed this up yet again. It still fingerprints and smudges with ease. It seems that you could rub it off a little easier, but overall my recommendation stays the same here as it did with the M2. The color's beautiful, but please don't buy it unless you want to be stuck with a forever smudgy looking laptop. Instead, get one of the other colors like the beautiful one I have there. Third, the support for 2 5K external monitors is only useful if you use the setup at home at your desk with the lid closed. The M2 and M1 Airs can't natively do this. But if you do want to use this setup at home with those laptops, you can always buy a display link capable dock that allows you to connect two screens. So to me, this feature is useful, yes, but given that most people buy a MacBook Air for its portability and maximum use it with one monitor like I do, it's probably not the reason to upgrade for most people. Fourth, the SSD or solid state hard drive speed has been improved over the M2, but this is not really an upgrade. It's more like a fix to a problem Apple created for no reason at all in the M2 because it worked fine in the M1. For context, the base model of the M2 MacBook Air used only one SSD module instead of the two that we saw on the M1 and the two that we're now seeing on the M3. And what that meant was slower read and write speed on your hard disk. Now, as you asked in my full M2 MacBook Air review, does this really make a perceptible difference to the user? Would you notice the speed if I didn't tell you about it? Not really, it's not that obvious. And most of us nowadays work online on the browser or the cloud anyway, so for most people, it's not a reason enough to buy the M3. And for those who do a lot of photo and video editing on their MacBook, those people wouldn't buy the base model anyway. They would spec up the RAM and the hard drive and probably buy a MacBook Pro instead for the fan-based cooling. So again, it's good Apple fixed it, but I can't really justify you spending 10% more just for this. Okay, so if you're still wondering whether to buy the M3 MacBook Air, then ask yourself, who are you? If you're someone who does the everyday stuff, browsing, email, photo editing, a light bit of video editing even, running some basic code, then honestly you don't need an M3. You don't really even need an M2. I would grab the M1 whilst the stocks last. You can get it for 300, even 400 bucks cheaper and use the money you saved to buy a nice Apple Watch or a pair of AirPods to go with it. Or if the M1 is no longer available on third-party websites, get an M2, you'll love it. But if you're someone who wants to spec up their laptop for longer term use as a serious developer or editor, you'd rather spec up an M2 with more RAM and storage and save your money on the M3 chip. And for most serious professionals who use sustained workloads and really go hard at the processor, you're going to get a Pro anyway. So basically, the M3 Air is almost for no one. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. It's a great thing for consumers. Apple has raised the bar so crazy high with its own chips, and they've become so good that even they are struggling to find improvements that are truly meaningful to people. So if I've successfully convinced you to consider an M2 or even grab an M1 whilst you still can, I'd recommend that you give a quick watch to my full reviews on both these laptops before you make your decision, because there are a couple of models within those laptops that are actually going to be like throwing your money away, and you want to avoid those specific models and get the right ones. See you in the other video.